Responding to user interaction via events is at the core of all web apps, so we're going to start focusing on that in this video. Let's go ahead and kick things off by removing all of the ES6 files. We can just close down those tabs. Feel free to leave them around in the playground folder and feel free to reference them down the line if you ever forget how any of those features work. Now, we're going to be making changes to app.js, so I am going to shut down Babel, use the up arrow key to reload that command, and we are going to rerun it with the file app.js. We can remove everything before the extension. We do want to search for a file in the source folder. It's called app.js. There we go. Now let's just switch over to the browser for a second, ensure that it is indeed rendering. It is, and now we're ready to talk about event handlers inside of our React applications. To kick things off, let's delete this user profile example. This was really nice when we were exploring the basics of rendering. We were able to go through the video, adding features together to one of the little apps, and then we had a second little app that you were able to add features to as part of your challenge. We're still going to have a second little app. We're just going to switch it up to add a little bit of user interaction into the mix. So the second app is going to become a counter. We're going to render a number to the screen starting at 0, and we're going to have buttons that the user can click to change the count. We'll have a +1 button to add 1 to the number and a -1 to subtract 1 from the number. And as that number changes, we're going to make sure to update it in the browser. So as you click the button, you're going to see the change reflected. To kick off this little project, we are going to create a template. We're going to recreate the template to variable we just deleted. The content's just going to look a little bit different. And we are still going to render it to the screen. So template 2. We're going to be adding 2 elements inside of here, an H1, which is going to display the current count, and a button, which is going to add 1 to the count. You'll be doing the -1 button on your own. Since we do have multiple elements, we have to create a wrapper div. I'm going to set that div up, and we'll kick things off with the H1 right here. I'm going to open it. I'm going to close it. And inside of here, we'll start off with a little label so people know what they're looking at, count : space. And right here, this is where we're going to inject the current count. Now, we don't have a variable for it, but we can go ahead and create one called count. Up above, I'm going to use let, since we are going to change this variable's value. Let count equal 0. Perfect. Now we can test things out by saving the file, and as long as we see count 0 showing up, which we are seeing, we are good to go. And now let's take a quick moment to talk about attributes in JSX. So we're going to create that button, right? We're going to have a button, and the button is going to have some text, which will go inside of the button tags. We're going to start off with the +1 button, which we'll build out together. Now the attributes, as we have in HTML, they sit right here, and we already explored how we can add ID on, and it works exactly as you might expect. The ID attribute and the value get passed through from JSX into the HTML that gets rendered. If I type my ID right here and I save the file, we're going to see that brand new button, even though clicking it does nothing. We'll wire that up in just a second. But if we head into the Elements panel and we crack open our 2 divs, we are going to get to the H1 and the button does indeed have an ID equal to my ID. So there we have it. ID gets passed through correctly. What about another really common attribute? Class, for example. Class is used to add identifiers onto your elements that can be shared across multiple elements. So if I'm using a styles framework like Bootstrap or Foundation, I might add a button class onto all of my buttons. Now, if I go ahead and save this, the browser is going to refresh. Over here, we can crack open those divs. But this time around, you see that class is not showing up, and we're actually getting an error over inside of the console. If we head over to the console, we can check that out right here. Warning, unknown DOM property class. Did you mean class name? So this brings us to our first important lesson with JSX attributes. Some attributes from HTML, like ID, work exactly the same way. Others have gotten renamed. So class now needs to be called class name in JSX. If we save the file like this, that is going to refresh the application. We have no error. And if we head over to Elements and we go through those 2 divs, we are going to see a button with the ID attribute set correctly and the class attribute set correctly, even though we specified class name over here. Now that can be really infuriating when you're first starting, but it's important to note that this is happening because certain things inside of JavaScript, they're reserved words. For example, let, const. And in our case, class, like this, it's also reserved. This is the new keyword we use to create classes in ES6, which we'll be doing in the next section. So we actually can't use class here. We have to use class name. Now, in the end of the day, what does template2 equal? Template2 is just an object. So we know that our JSX gets converted into react.createElement calls. What comes back from that is actually just an object. So let's go ahead and print that out real quick. Console.log template2. Now, the information stored in this object is not particularly useful for our purposes. We'll never be doing this again, but it is going to help illustrate why things like class can't be used and why class name has to be used instead. Now, if we go over to the console, we're going to see right away we are getting an object printing. And if we crack this open, we are going to see just a ton of information. Most of it we can ignore. A lot of it we'll talk about later in the course. For now, the type is important. Here we have our root div. Inside of this div, we know we have our h1 and our button, and those actually live in the props object in the children array. Here we have two items. The first one is the h1. The second one is the button. If we open up the h1, we see we have a type of h1. And if we open up the props, that's actually where we start to see some of the information rendered in the h1. Under children, we have the count string and we have the number 0. Now, if we go ahead and close the h1, we can take a peek at that second guy, which is our button. And if we go into the button props, we have children, that's the text, class name, here's our class name, and ID, there is the ID. So this is where that actually gets used. If we type class, we're going to be using a reserved word inside of JavaScript, which is definitely something we want to avoid. Class name, though, is not reserved, so we can indeed use this on an object property. So in the end of the day, some JSX attributes stay the same as their HTML companion. Some have changed. Don't worry, this is not a guessing game. You can get a complete rundown on that over at the React docs. So let's take a quick peek. To get that docs page, I am going to head over to Google and Google React DOM elements, and that should bring up the first result as the DOM elements doc page. That's exactly what I'm seeing here. And if we head over here, we can get a complete rundown on our elements, on those attributes. So down below, we have differences in attributes. We have some that we haven't explored and others, like class name, we have explored. I personally find the most useful part of this page to be down below. If we scroll down just a little bit, we can get a complete list of all supported HTML attributes. We're going to see things we've used like ID right here, class name right here, and others we haven't used. For example, autofocus. Now you'll notice that all of these attributes have become camel cased. So inside of HTML, we would still type out autofocus, all of these characters, but the F would have been lowercase. Inside of JSX, all of these attributes got camel cased. So if you do want to use an attribute, for example, if you find yourself looking to set something like the placeholder, you can come here, look for it, and you can see that placeholder is actually one of the ones that has not changed. So you would type it out just like you would inside of regular HTML. We'll be using quite a few of these throughout the course, but it is very useful to know this list exists, and it's useful to know why some of the values have changed. They've changed because some things like class are reserved keywords in JavaScript. So now that we have some attributes set up, how does this really help us towards our goal? The goal being to set up an event listener. Well, we're actually really close to that. The last thing I want to explore is how we can actually set our attributes like ID equal to a JavaScript expression. Now, whatever this expression ends up being, that's the value for ID. So I could have a variable up above, const some ID. I could set it equal to my ID here, and I could reference some ID inside of that JavaScript expression. Now, what's going to be the end result? Well, the end result is that the ID for this button will equal the string, my ID here. We can save app.js to prove this, head back into the application, into the elements panel, crack open those two divs, and there we have it. ID equals my ID here. Now, all of this is useful because in order to set up a click event, we are going to be specifying a custom attribute on our button, one that does not exist inside of HTML. Right here, we're going to go ahead and remove ID and class, and we're also going to remove the SumID variable, and we are going to type on uppercase C click. On click gets set equal to a JavaScript expression. And right here, this is where we want to provide a function. The function that we want to have executed every time this button gets clicked. Now we can actually make that function up above. This value is not going to change, so we can use a const, and we'll call it something like add1. We'll set it equal to an arrow function using the syntax we just explored. Now we're not going to take any arguments here. All we care about is that the function fired. Every time it fired, we know that the button was clicked. And for the moment, let's just go ahead and log something. So we're going to console.log, and we'll just log out the method name itself, add1. So every time we see add1 in the console, we know this callback was indeed fired. Now how do we register it? We just reference the name of the variable. So right here, add1. Now if we save app.js, we can test this out over inside of the browser. I'm going to go ahead and go to the console tab, click the button, and this time around, we're seeing add1 show up one time for every button click. So every single time I click that button, that code runs. And this is a great step in the right direction towards creating meaningful applications that respond to user interaction. Now we could have structured this a little differently as well. I referenced the add1 variable. We know with count though, if we reference a variable, that's fine, but we could also just type the number in directly. And the same is actually true with things like onClick. So I'm going to switch this back to count. And instead of referencing a function, we can actually just type a function in. This is exactly the same as what we just had. Now the formatting might look a little different. It might look a little wonky, but we can still console.log some value here. And that is still going to print every single time I click the button. So we've registered the function to call on click in line. If I save app.js, we can take a moment to prove that this works. I click +1, some value here prints because that is the new callback for the click handler on this button. Now that is not what we want. In almost all cases, we want to reference a function defined elsewhere. It can get a little weird if you have a bunch of functions defined right in your JSX. So we're going to remove that guy. And inside of those curly braces, once again, we are just going to reference add1. Perfect. Now it is challenge time. Your challenge is to create 2 new buttons and 2 new functions that fire for each of those buttons. So I can outline that for you right here. First up, you're going to make a button with the text -1. This is going to be our -1 button, and it eventually is going to modify the count and re-render the application. For now, all you're going to do is console.log the name -1. So make the button with the -1 text, set up -1 function, and register. You want to register it as the onClick handler. And finally, you're just going to log -1 every single time that button gets clicked. And we're going to do the exact same thing with one more button. You're going to make a reset button. So make reset button. This one can have a text value of reset. And once again, for the moment, you're just going to define a function that fires every time the button gets clicked. We can call that set up reset function. And then all you're going to do is log reset every single time the button gets clicked. So we're not worried about modifying count just yet or getting anything re-rendered to the screen. If I were to change count inside of here, it'll have no effect on the application since this has already been compiled and rendered. We're going to worry about that in a little bit. For now, I just want you to make those 2 buttons right here, add 2 new functions right here, make sure to log something for each one, then test your work. Click the -1 button, make sure -1 prints into the console. Click the reset button, make sure the reset message prints in the console. You can use this as a reference for what to do. Take some time to pause the video, test your work, and when you're done, click play. All right, let's go ahead and knock this one out. I'm going to start off with the -1 button. I'm going to create that button. I'm going to set the text equal to -1, and I'm going to go ahead and close it. Now we're going to make a second one, so we can copy and paste this right now, changing the text value for that second button over to reset. Now it's time to create those 2 functions and actually register them. First up, const -1. That's going to be obviously for the -1 button. We'll set up our arrow function. And as mentioned, for the moment, no need to modify the count. We're just going to console.log a message so we know the event handler was set up. -1 right inside of console.log. Now we're going to create a second one first. I'll do that right now before registering either of them. This is going to be for reset, const reset. We're going to set that equal to an arrow function. And this will also just log a value, console.log, right here, reset. Excellent. So that is it for our two functions. We can now go ahead and use them by adding on click. On click. We're going to set that equal to inside of curly braces. In this case, the -1 variable we just defined up above. We're going to do the exact same thing for reset, setting up on click, setting it equal to right here, reset. Now let's go ahead and save app.js and see what happens when our program runs. We have +1, which we set up together. That's still working. Great. We have -1, which you just set up on your own. That is working as well. And we have reset. All of our logs are printing correctly for each of the individual buttons. And there we have it. We've now explored a little user interaction inside of React. It's not completely wired up yet, but it is a step in the right direction. Down below, I'm going to remove the challenge comments since we just completed all of that. And there we have it. Now in the next video, we are going to explore how we can re-render the application with the new count every single time one of the buttons gets clicked. I'm real excited to get to that. And then we'll continue on looking at other events we have available to us inside of JSX. So stay tuned. I'll see you in the next one.